I love watching philosophy videos, and this includes from people on both sides of the God question. And last week I stumbled across an argument for God's existence that I've never heard before, and I have to admit, it actually, genuinely made me question my position as an agnostic atheist.
Next, we have the contingency arguments. This is where we start to get to the good arguments, okay? I really think that the contingency argument is irrefutable. I think it's one of the greatest arguments that we have. I'm thinking about putting it in where do I sign, but right now it's going in the that convinced me. Okay, so I'm putting it up there. Hold on. Sorry for my indecision there. It's going in there.
This is because it didn't rely on emotion or wishful thinking, but because it actually seemed to follow from a simple fact. So over the next few days, week actually, I read more about it, researched, dove deeper, and tried to figure out whether it actually worked. And in today's video, I'll explain what the argument is, why it is so convincing, and whether it ended up changing my mind or not. Alright, let's get into it. So this argument comes from Jesus and Whatnot, a very good and considerably larger YouTuber than me. And in an argument with Nate.fm, he used this as one of his main ways to try to justify his belief in the existence of the Christian God.
Anything with parts has potency. Premise 2. Anything with both actuality and potency requires an outside cause. Premise 3. The material universe is made up of parts and therefore has actuality and potency. Conclusion, therefore, the universe requires an outside cause.
So when I first heard this argument, I kind of skimmed over it in my mind to see if there's any points I could attack or if there are any just flaws in his reasoning. And at first, I didn't find any. So I dove deeper, and then I found something. Now, at that time, I wasn't sure whether this would actually help in refuting his conclusion, but it is still important to note, and it will come into play later. So Noah's first premise is anything with parts inherently has potency. Now, normally, when philosophers talk about potency, what they mean is the ability to change. Now, for example, a green banana is not, at that moment, a yellow banana. It is not, also at that moment, a rubber chicken. Neither this rubber chicken or this yellow banana, in relation to this green banana, exist. But importantly, this yellow banana seems different than this rubber chicken, again, in relation to this green banana. This is where I think Aristotle kind of coined the term potency in relation to how we use it today. See, he thought that it was so importantly different that this yellow banana could exist from this green banana and this rubber chicken could not. He actually gave this green banana the quality of having the potential to turn into this yellow banana. This is a real quality of the green banana. And this is normally how potency is used in philosophy today. Now, importantly, Noah isn't using it that way. He's using it to mean anything with parts could have been organized differently. For example, this pen, this cap could have been over here, this tip, I could unscrew it, and I could put it on top. There's a bunch of different ways that this could be organized. But store that in the back of your head for now. We'll move on to the second premise. He says, anything with both actuality and potency requires an outside cause. So actuality means it actually exists. This pen in its current state actually exists. Now, normally, again, normal definition of potency, it might have the potential or potency to burn if I put it to a fire. But how Noah means it, anything that exists and could be organized differently requires an outside cause. And Noah doesn't mean for its existence, but for how it is organized. This pen requires an outside cause for how it is organized instead of other possibilities it could be organized. And from there, getting to the conclusion he wants is relatively simple. He just says the material, the universe, as we know it, is made up of parts and therefore has potency. And because it exists, we can see it exists, we live in it, therefore it has actuality, and we just proved it has potency, it requires an outside cause for the reason that it's organized today. And then he goes on to ascribe a bunch of properties to that outside cause.
The outside cause is actus purus, and therefore is without part, quantity, measure, fault, lacking, wanting, change, beginning or end, contingency, dependence, error, defect, disorder, or composition. This outside cause would also be a being, as existing is an actualization of the potential to exist. This being is perfect, as it lacks potency and any fault. This being is good, as all things are good insofar as they are actual.
So, as we explored, Noah is using a different definition of potency than the one generally used. If he was using the normal definition of potency, we'd go into something like the argument from motion. But he's not. So this is actually a form of the contingency argument. This pen requires a explanation for the way it is organized, and perhaps it came from a machine. That machine requires an explanation or cause for the way that was organized, and so on and so forth. Now, Noah, as many proponents of the contingency argument do, is trying to establish a causal chain and then establish that that causal chain must terminate in some way. Now, it's important to distinguish between two different types of causation. As they're called today, one of them we'll call linear causation, and one of them is hierarchical causation. For linear causation, the example is typically used a father begetting a son. Now, begetting is kind of the opposite of conceiving, right? So we have this guy, Adam. Adam begets a son called John. John begets a son called Josh, and Josh begets a son called Bob. Does Bob need this first guy, Adam, around for Josh to beget a son? No, he doesn't. Does he need the next guy or the next guy, his father? No, he doesn't. Each of these agents in this causal chain has independent causal power and ability to exercise this power to beget their own son or sons. See, this causal chain works because each of these agents can contribute and then leave. We don't need all members of this causal chain to be present in order for it to continue working. Now, you might ask, in contrast with what? Well, the stereotypical example is a hand pushing a stick, pushing a stone. Which of these has independent causal power? Only me, and therefore my hand. My hand will push a stick that is simultaneously pushing a stone. If my hand were to stop pushing a stick, were to leave the causal chain, would the stick of its own accord continue pushing the stone? No, it would not, because it only has secondary causal power. My hand is the one that is initiating this movement, this causal chain. If my hand were to leave, as the first father was, this causal chain would not continue as it did with the fathers. So this is the two different types. The second, the latter, with the hand, stick, stone, is hierarchical causation, and the first, the former, was linear causation. Now, I agree with Noah's conclusion. Actually, yes, I agree with what he established. The material universe, as we're experiencing it in every passing second, must have some reason for the way that is organized in that second that we experience it. I think that's relatively uncontroversial. If it did not have a cause, things would seem to just fall apart. But as I showed in the clip, Noah also believes that eventually this causal chain must terminate somewhere and in something outside of the material universe. Now notice that Noah does not say, 1 second ago, or the smallest part of time ago, there must have been God. No, he does not say that. He acknowledges the fact that the causal chain can continue for a while in a style of linear causation, right? The universe has its own independent causal power, or agents within the universe have independent causal power. But he says, at some point, this causal chain must terminate. It cannot be infinite. Now, the reason that this was so convincing to me was because I conflated the standard definition in philosophy of potency with the one that Noah is using here. I accepted his definition for the first bit and then switched over to the standard definition for the second bit. And if this would follow, if these two premises would stand and get to the conclusion that he wanted, which is that the material universe must have an outside cause, then it would get to the conclusion that Noah wants, which is an actus purus, force cause.
If the outside cause has potency, it would also require an outside cause. Therefore, the outside cause has no potency. The outside cause has no potency. Therefore, the outside cause is actus purus,
or pure act, which is, again, now moving from the contingency argument to the argument from motion, which is a whole nother thing entirely. But all you need to know is that's not what we're actually talking about here. This is the contingency argument, and Noah actually addresses that in a separate video.
Everything is contingent upon something else. Everything with potency, as we described earlier.
So as this is the contingency argument, and Noah agrees that the cause of the universe, being organized as it is in one moment, could be things within the universe within the last moment, the only thing left to explain is this causal chain. Noah says this can't be infinite, as I showed. Why is that? Well, Noah uses the example of...
Imagine a chandelier, right? Where there's chains connecting going up. So the first chain is what we have right now. And then above that, there's another chain. And that's the contingency. If that chain went up forever, it would never hold up. It would just fall. But if there's a first cause, right, something that causes that chain to exist in the first place, like a ceiling, then the whole chain can hold up. So it can't go on to infinity.
But Noah here is conflating linear and hierarchical causation. See, the universe has its own causal power. Agents within it have their own independent causal power and can continue to exercise that power as time goes on, and they turn into new causal agents or other separate causal agents emerge. Now, Noah links this to a chandelier. He says, okay, well, this must have began at some point. If he's talking about hierarchical causation, which is, again, the hand pushing the stick, pushing the stone, yes, it must have began at some point because all of these things only have secondary causal power. For example, if we have a seemingly infinite, or perhaps even actually infinite number of cups lined up, and there is no water in any of the cups, can we get water in the last cup or the present time that we're in, by pouring the contents of one cup into the next infinite times? No, we can't. Not if there's no water in any of the cups. But Noah doesn't acknowledge the fact that each of these cups has water in it. They all have the ability to impose their will on the universe around it. They all have their own independent causal power. Well, perhaps Noah is leaning very hard into the contingency argument side of things. Perhaps he just means that this cannot be infinite because causal chains can't be infinite. Going back to the chandelier example, what caused the first link? What caused the first part in the chain? Well, this is going about it entirely the wrong way. See, William Lane Craig actually uses this in part of his Coulomb cosmological argument. He says there cannot be an infinite past because how do we reach today? See, the whole concept of infinity is you cannot get there by successive addition because no matter how far you reach, you could always add 1 or 0.1, any amount, and that you wouldn't have reached infinity. I agree. Anyone that thinks there's an infinite past will agree if they know what they're talking about. And while this may seem like it makes it impossible for us to experience today, that is only if you take an A theory of time. For example, if you actually do move through time through successive experiencing of those events. Perhaps it's a B theory or even a C theory that we haven't come up with or isn't mainstream yet of time, where we don't move through time. All of time just is. See, a good way to think of this, a good analogy is numbers. Pretend we are time 0. Whatever moment we're in, even as it's constantly moving along, that's time 0, okay? In the future, there's infinite numbers ahead of us, potentially, or at least we're approaching infinity, right? We're not going to get there because it's going to be by successive addition through maybe some views of time, but we are going more and more through time as we go on. Could we have gotten to 0? Can you get to 0? Because there's negative numbers, right, too. You can go to negative infinity in math. Can you get to 0 then? Yes, but to propose that negative infinity is some starting point and then, okay, negative infinity plus 1, negative infinity plus 2, and eventually you're going to get to 0. That's not what infinity means. We're not a bunch of runners running a race and there's some line in the sand, and then from there you go. Everyone runs forward and eventually they get to today. No, there's just no starting point. So Noah just doesn't understand how an infinite past would actually work. He's conflating linear and hierarchical causation, or he just doesn't understand this. One of the two. So yeah, this was actually genuinely hard for my position, but I think I was conflating some terms in my head, and Noah doesn't fully understand at least one concept. So yeah, I don't think this is actually as persuasive as it may sound or seem to me at first. Let me know what you think about my thoughts here. Like, sub if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll respond to every single comment. Alright, thank you.